shadows of iron and bone, Shark Island, the first industrial hell of the 20th century. It didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with a simple, brutal calculus of greed. The ancestral territories of the Herero and Nama peoples, lush pastures, fertile land, and vital cattle routes stretching under the bright African sun, proved too tempting for the newly arrived German colonizers. This was the era of the scramble for Africa, where European powers carved a continent into properties, its people an afterthought. First came the treaties, often signed at gunpoint, their terms written in a foreign tongue, promising protection in exchange for land and sovereignty. Then came the systematic deception. German settlers, backed by the Schutztruppe colonial forces, encroached further, seizing the Hereros' sacred cattle, the very foundation of their wealth and social structure. When disputes arose, the response was brutal and humiliating. Public floggings and the public rape of women became tools of terror, witnessed by entire villages to shatter their spirit and will to resist. The powder keg ignited in January 1904. Pushed beyond endurance, the Herero rose in a desperate rebellion, killing around 120 German settlers. They could not fathom the scale of the retribution that would follow. Berlin dispatched Lieutenant General Lothar von Trotha, a man hardened by colonial warfare in East Africa. His solution was final. After defeating the main Herero force at the Battle of Waterberg in August 1904, he deliberately did not encircle them. Instead, he drove tens of thousands of men, women, and children, the entire nation, eastward into the waterless vastness of the Omaheka Desert. Then he issued his Vernichtungsbefehl, his extermination order, a document that would echo through history. It stated coldly, within the German borders, every Herero, with or without a rifle, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will no longer accept women or children. I shall drive them back to their people or have them fired on. These words marked the first official declaration of genocide in the 20th century. But bullets were inefficient, so the Germans enacted a more calculated ecological genocide. They poisoned the few water holes they knew of. Squads of soldiers guarded the perimeter of the desert, ensuring no one could escape. German patrols systematically slaughtered any remaining livestock. The desert itself was weaponized, transformed into a vast open-air concentration camp under the relentless sun. Imagine a mother, her mind unraveling from a thirst you cannot comprehend, making an unimaginable choice. She takes a sharp stone and slits the veins of her own dying child, hoping the few drops of blood might moisten its parched, swollen lips. The elderly lay where they fell, their tongues so swollen from dehydration, they split and no longer fit in their mouths. Children, most vulnerable, died first, their small bodies blackening and contorting under the sun. Years later, travelers and trackers would find vast fields of skeletons, the bones of families still locked in their final, desperate embraces. For the few who survived this inferno or were captured later, a fate arguably worse than death awaited. They were herded into a network of forced labor camps. The most infamous, the most chillingly efficient, was on Shark Island, a barren, windswept piece of land off the coast of Lüderitz. This was not merely a camp. It was the first industrial-scale human destruction factory of the 20th century, a direct prototype for the Nazi death camps that would follow decades later. Prisoners, skeletal and draped in little more than rags, were forced to work 14-hour days in the freezing Atlantic wind, building the harbor, the railway, and the very town of Lüderitz for their oppressors. Hunger was a deliberate, calculated tool of control. Rations were less than 200 grams of boiled rice a day, a slow starvation that drove men to eat sand, leather, and rotting waste from the German kitchens. Death from exposure, scurvy, and typhus was rampant, but the true, unique horror of Shark Island was the so-called medical research. This was the domain of men like Dr. Eugen Fischer, who would later become a key architect of Nazi racial hygiene. He arrived on the island asserting that Africans were an inferior race, and he used living human beings to prove it. His experiments were a catalog of horrors ripped from a nightmare. Women were injected with cleaning agents, acid, and boiling water into their wombs and ovaries to study the effects of inflammation and sterilization. Men and women were castrated without anesthesia in brutal, unsanitary procedures that often tore out intestines and organs, leaving them to die of infection. Children's limbs were surgically amputated, not for medical need, but to study the differences in bone structure and healing between races. Some of these children were kept alive for days in agony as specimens to be observed. The heads of executed inmates, or those who died from the experiments, were severed. The flesh was meticulously boiled and scraped away, and the bleached skulls were carefully packed into crates, numbered, and shipped to universities and museums in Berlin, where they were studied as scientific specimens to advance the pseudoscience of racial superiority. The casual brutality of the guards was a constant. They entertained themselves by forcing mothers to feed their own excrement to their children, then executing the women for being brutish and uncivilized. The camp commandant was particularly notorious for his personal harem. He would personally select the most beautiful young women for his sexual slavery, and when he grew bored of them, he would casually hand them over to Dr. Fischer's laboratory for experimentation. Executions were public spectacles. Hangings, firing squads, beatings with clubs and rifle butts until nothing recognizable remained. The bodies were not buried. In a final, profound act of desecration, they were stacked into giant, grotesque pyramids and burned on open pyres. The ash, the literal remains of human beings, was then collected in sacks and sold to local farmers, shipped back to Germany to be used as fertilizer. The crematorium chimney on Shark Island, though small, operated continuously. The sweet, sickly, and unmistakable smell of burning human flesh became a permanent, heavy cloud that hung over the camp and drifted into the town, a constant olfactory reminder of the industry of death at its doorstep. When the camp was finally closed years later, the Germans meticulously destroyed almost all physical evidence, burning records and dismantling structures, hoping to bury their crimes in the sand. But they could not erase memory. The survivors, those who walked out of that hell, carried the stories with them. They told of being forced to handle the corpses of their own families, stacking them for the pyres. They remembered the feeling of their children growing cold in their arms. They could never forget the taste of food mixed with sand and wood shavings, a taste that meant another day of life. This was the first genocide of the 20th century, and it established the gruesome blueprint for all that followed. The same methods, dehumanization through racial theory, the concentration camp system, industrialized slave labor, unethical medical experimentation, and the industrial disposal of human bodies, were studied, refined, and perfected by the Nazis just 30 years later. Fischer's research directly formed the basis of the Nuremberg laws, and his most famous student, Josef Mengele, simply continued this grisly work on a large R scale at Auschwitz. The shadows cast by German colonialism in Namibia stretched far into the future, directly into the heart of the Third Reich, and Shark Island remains an unhealed wound on the conscience of humanity. The precise place where, For the first time in the modern industrial age, human beings were systematically and scientifically transformed into raw material for experiments, fuel for the fire, and fertilizer for the soil. It was the true birthplace of the mechanized horror that would come to define the new century.